Hi, everyone. Those of you who are just joining, we're just getting ready to get started. There's quite a few people still joining in, so we'll give everybody another minute or so to get started. In the meantime, I'm going to launch a poll here just to make sure that you can hear us. So if you wouldn't mind just answering that, let me know if you can hear the sound of my voice. Thanks. Okay, we got one person saying they can't hear anything, or two people saying that. So if you can't hear us, it seems like everybody else can. So you might want to try dialing in by phone or by the webinar link with an audio. If you need help with that, just go ahead and use the Q&A or the chat function to ask the question, and we'll get you set up with that. Okay, we figured out what the issue is. It seems like the phone dial-in ID didn't work, so we're just going to test that. Give us a moment to deal with the technical difficulties here. Okay, so it looks like Caitlin just sent out the webinar ID. So if you wouldn't mind trying that, and for the two people who weren't able to get connected on the phone, just make sure that you can get connected. Otherwise, it looks like we got everybody else up and running. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started here. And I'm going to turn on my camera here so you guys can see me. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Chintan Sutaria. Most of you already know me or have heard from me at some point or another. I'm the founder of CalcuQuote. Standing next to me here is Matt, who is the founder of securityprogram.io and Gemini. Quick introduction about the webinar, and then I'm going to let Matt speak here. So this webinar is part of a monthly series of webinars that CalcuQuote puts on. The purpose of the webinars is not to talk about CalcuQuote specifically. It's really just to come together as an industry to learn as a group, right? So what we try to do is find topics and trends that are interesting to the EMS space so that we can kind of have a knowledge sharing center. So sometimes we bring in speakers like Matt here to share their expertise, and sometimes we talk about things. So topics in the past have ranged from everything related to inventory and purchasing to sales and marketing. So we try to cover a breadth of topics. If you like the webinar today and want to know more of these types of webinars, then you can always check out our website. That's calcuquote.com. We have a blog and a resource center there. You can also, if you're a CalcuQuote customer, you have access to Learn CQ, which is an online knowledge base where we have much more in-depth content, both about CalcuQuote as a software, but also industry-related articles there. With that, let's get started. Matt, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. It's fun to get a chance to talk to people about security. Not everybody's idea of a fun topic in many cases. Just to give everyone a bit of background on myself, I'm a software developer who got passionate about security about 12 years ago. Served on the board of OWASP, which is a industry body that produces standards and so forth around application security, and founded securityprogram.io about a year ago to help our customers solve problems around building security programs for their organizations that help them handle policies and all the broad different things that they needed to do to close deals with bigger companies in general was one of the main drivers, or secure investments and so forth. Yeah, I don't know. There's other things that are relevant here.
That's plenty helpful. Thanks, Matt. Okay, so let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about CMMC, but really at a high level, what we're going to go over is what is CMMC and what are some of the things you need to know about it, where do you need to be, and what timeline, and how are you going to get there. So Matt's going to talk us through that. He's got quite a bit of information for us to share. One thing I want to emphasize throughout this is the purpose of today's webinar is for us to be able to share knowledge with you guys. So if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate at all throughout the presentation to ask them. There's a little Q&A button on your webinar controls. So use that to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll try to field those questions over to Matt so he can answer those. And throughout, I'll also be probably interacting with you a little bit and asking some of my own questions on behalf of our audience here.
Excellent.
Okay.
So CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And so I wanted to start with just sort of a who, what, where, when, why, how table. Who does it apply to? It applies to any Department of Defense contractor and their subcontractors. There is also another new party involved, which is a third-party verification party. It's a certified third-party assessment organization that's involved in auditing firms that do CMMC. What does CMMC say you have to do? It says you have to implement a security plan and measures appropriate to the type of data that you handle. Where does it apply? Generally in the United States, related to the DoD supply chain. When? It just came out in January 2020, so it's very new, hot off the presses. In fact, the auditors are not yet trained for how to audit against CMMC. But we expect to see it start going into place or into RFPs in 2020, June 2020 through maybe September 2020. We expect to see things really start to happen with CMMC where it drifts out into the supply chain. Why did CMMC happen? What's the origin? What's the cause for it? It's about a huge amount of cybercrime losses in the DoD supply chain, and the idea that the existing controls, essentially self-attestation, were proving insufficient for securing the kind of information that CMMC applies to. We'll talk about how we do CMMC through the rest of the discussion. So kind of the root topic that we need to understand in the context of CMMC is controlled unclassified information, which is CUI. CUI is sensitive information that requires protection but is not classified at a federal level. The CUI have rules around marking in terms of how we put headers on a document to indicate what kind of information is in the document, how we share that information in email, how we store the data in a physical setting, etc. And so there are a number of rules around how we handle CUI, and ultimately what will drive what you have to do with CMMC will be what type of CUI you have. A great resource for this is a registry of different types of CUI that's at archive.gov. And it outlines, for instance, on the right side, we're showing controlled technical information, which is a category that I think may be relevant to folks on the phone. Essentially, this is a category of information that might look like a bill of materials for something that's in itself related to war, for instance.
So that, Matt, that's an interesting point, because I know sometimes when we're talking to customers that are dealing with aerospace and defense work and their ITAR companies and things like that, there's often a question about what constitutes controlled information versus not. So from your experience, is a bill of material always CUI, or is it more broad than that or more narrow?
I hate to say it depends. It depends on how it's going to be used and what it's a bill of materials for. If the thing it's for is classified, then yes, it's going to end up being protected or special CUI. And there's different levels. There's a concept of basic CUI or specified CUI. Ultimately, in a way, that should come from your the person that you're a vendor to, or your customer. They should know what that data is. And I guess this might be a good point to mention that a lot of times when security conversations happen, people get very anxious and they feel on the spot that they have to have all the solutions right away. And I think it's important to recognize that we all do the best when we have conversations and dialogue about what's really required. And so I think it's very reasonable as a contractor to ask the person, your customer, how they think that data needs to be treated. Of course, you have to be ready for that answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Thought it might be helpful to talk about the origins of CMMC. On the left side, we talk about the sort of security standards origins of the standard. In that sense, these are NIST standards, NIST 171, CIS standards. Ultimately, these are pieces that got baked into CMMC, you could think. On the right side, we're representing kind of the root cause of why did the DoD do this, and it's because they wanted to manage vendor supply chain risk. They were losing potentially plans or data or information or bids based on information that was leaking out of the supply chain. Something that the CMMC adds to what you might be familiar with NIST 171 is the idea of maturity. And so there are different levels you can reach within CMMC. And so I want to take a minute and talk about these different levels. Generally speaking, it's thought that we want to get to level 3 if we're protecting CUI. So if we have specified CUI that needs to be protected, we need to be at level 3. And as you can see in this picture, hopefully, there are 130 practices associated with reaching level 3. So that's a lot of significant work. If you're actually doing more than protecting CUI, maybe you need to be able to respond to an advanced persistent threat, then we want to see you get to level 4 or 5. And that at level 5 involves 171 practices. So this is not necessarily a small amount of work, but the maturity angle of it allows you to build on where you start.
So we have a question from the audience over here. So the question is basically that the primes aren't, so it says none of the primes have sent us technical data that has markings related to CUI, but the flow down on the PO, that data may be considered as CUI. So what's the rollout plan for this? I mean, is it something that you should expect to start to see on purchase orders and technical data already? Or is it something that will be rolled out over the summer and in the fall?
So I expected that the CUI would be marked already, but that will certainly be more stringent as CMMC comes into play over the summer. It's interesting whether the composite parts need to be marked the same way. It seems like a apropos question.
It might be that they're not marking the parts and they're saying, yeah, we're flowing this down as all of our things are controlled or something, maybe.
Yes, and I think the other part of the question, sorry, I'm reading the question as well.
Yeah.
The other part of the question is, yes, CMMC will not instantly apply to everyone in a sense. Really the way that we see it happening is that the primes will be getting RFPs that mandate certain level of CMMC maturity, and then that will essentially get passed by the primes to their chain of vendors, and that there will be discretionary audits that go into further detail and look at evidence behind the maturity. So another change, not to get ahead of ourselves, but another change in addition to maturity is there's these third-party organizations which will do actual audits and review evidence to prove that you're meeting the practices that are indicated and not just self-assessing favorably.
Right. Okay. And did I understand correctly that so it would be specified by your customer what level you need to get to, or maybe by the information that you're getting? But would I, as an organization, have some sort of benchmark to say, well, I need to be at this level, or is that driven by some other factors?
Well, I don't know the answer sort of in a blanket context, but I think my thinking about it would be, I would like to be able to get access to any contracts that are at level 3 generally, if I know that I have that kind of data. So self-assessing or understanding what kind of CUI I have and what I expect it to be handled, I expect it to be handled, would be a good first step toward knowing what level you need to actually get to. Does that make sense? Because you may not need to be at level 3 today, but there may be a contract that comes up where you do need to be at level 3 based on the data you have. And my position would be, it's best to work toward that over some time and be ready when the time comes, than to change course and decide that now we need to be at a higher level.
Gotcha. So basically, maybe part of your business strategy is that I need to go after these types of contracts or something like that.
Exactly. Either you're going to go after them or you're not, and you're leaving the door open for, is this part of our business direction?
Okay, sounds good. Just for the people on the audience right now, again, wanted to remind you there is a Q&A button, there is a chat option there, and also just to keep things lively here, I'm going to kick off a poll over here. So this is, the question is basically around, what level of CMMC based on your interactions with your customers or things like that, do you anticipate needing to get to?
And maybe can I make one more comment about the previous question? So I think you can expect your customers to tell you if you need to be at a certain level of CMMC, but that in my mind is only one input into your business strategy as far as where you want to be.
Got it. So then maybe it's not like, well, we should definitely be at level 5. It's like, well, do what's appropriate for what you need to do.
Right. And you could take the strategy of, we're going to do what our customers ask.
Mm-hmm.
That would be reasonable. But you could also look at the data you have and proactively decide, they may not even be asking for us to be at 3 yet, but we know they're going to very soon. And we know it's going to take us months of work to get to 3, let's say.
Right.
So we want to make sure we're ahead of that game. Something that I wanted to comment about is that the CMMC talks about cybersecurity as an allowable cost, which is a very specific term in the context of an RFP. And what this means is that it is going to be acceptable for prime vendors to pass on the costs of some of this work to the government in these contracts. And presumably it may be that it's also allowable for smaller contractors to pass the costs on to their customers as well.
Got it. So it's not like a mandate without any recognition that there is additional cost. Security does cost money, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's an important conversation to have
with your customer.
With your customer, yeah.
Which, from a quoting perspective, I can definitely appreciate that. You got to consider your cost. Somebody has to pay for it.
Right. So I tried to put myself in your shoes and think about what CMMC might mean for you. And I think the first is, obviously it depends on what kind of data you have. So if you know you're handling very special data, then you probably need to do more, and you need to be ready for the idea that you're going to get audited around that. The other thing is that in the communications we've had from the people administering CMMC, it's clear that they intend to audit more where the more sensitive data is. So if you're a level 4 or 5, there's probably more likelihood that you're going to get audited than if you're a level 1 or a level 2.
Okay. So then, as an EMS company, is this something that I guess, knowing the upcoming timeline and what's required from an audit perspective, do I have to get audited? Do I have to do the CMMC certification?
I believe that every vendor has to submit a CMMC self-attestation, but that does not mean that you have to be audited. The audited, it's almost like the way IRS does tax audits.
Okay.
Right. You have to report, but you don't necessarily have to expect an audit.
Okay. And do I even have to be compliant with CMMC? I guess, are there going to be cases where I don't have to be compliant with that?
Well, you have to have a level. And I think so to meet level 3, for instance, there's a scoring system where you have to get 110 points on this basic self-assessment.
Gotcha. Or I guess the alternative would be to say, I'm going to opt out of DoD contracts or something. And
that would be one alternative,
yeah.
But assuming that that's not something people want to do lightly, right? A good thing to do would be to self-assess. There's a process that's written down for how to report your self-assessment, which is part of essentially getting listed in a directory of CMMC vendors. So when I think the other thing I wanted to talk about is how do we sort of break down the process of getting ready? And often we think of security as being tool focused or very standards focused. And in this case, I would actually encourage everyone to think about this from a business perspective, from a sort of executive perspective. What does this standard mean to your firm? Are you planning to offer services that or products that are relevant to this? And if it is, do you have the buy-in and the resources to go do what you need to do? And if you don't, can you have that conversation with your executive management to be able to figure out how to navigate that, right? Often, if I'm in charge of a given product, it may be very difficult for me to actually do everything that's needed to meet the standard. I really need broad organizational support to do that. So I would normally say start and make sure that your roadmap is understood by the executive team around you, right? That you have support. The next thing I would suggest is looking at your current maturity, right? So you may have realistic or unrealistic ideas about where you fit today. Many of us think we're doing a pretty good job with security, but we don't know a lot of things. So the easiest way to do that is to self-assess with NIST 171A. Even though that's something that CMMC is based on, that's a good way to do that now. And then essentially it's a gap analysis, right? So item by item in that standard, whether you're doing a good job, and then wherever you're not doing a good job, you can prioritize work to close that gap. And essentially iterate on that process, right? Find a gap, fix it, find a gap, fix it, find a gap, prioritize the gaps, fix the most important one, and continue.
So that make sense? Yeah, it does. And so I know when we first started and Jim or I was helping us get up to speed on NIST 800-171, what we had done is once we decided, yes, this is something that we need to do, it was, okay, let's come up with, we tracked it all in a spreadsheet. Is that how you typically see people getting started, or like what's the best way to take that first step?
It is a very common way to get started, and I don't think I would discourage people from doing that because it's a concrete thing you can do. Of course, we built a system to try to make that easier, so I don't want to not say anything about that.
Right.
But most of these standards are public. You can go get them and you can start working on them yourselves. And to get the spreadsheet of, let's say, NIST 171 and start trying to understand the controls and assessing, like, can I even do this? And if I can do this, where are we? It's a great start. It's a great start. I included this slide really to help get into another level of detail about that self-assessment process. So in order to self-assess, you need to know your score and essentially report in to get into the DoD supplier list. When you do this, you need to know that you're going to you either need to already have a score of 110 or you need to know a projected date when you're going to get to 110. And on the right side, we're showing control areas. So there's 17 control areas that range from access control to recovery to communications. Each of those has many, many specific detailed items you need to be aware of within that. And so I guess I'm partly just trying to capture the breadth of what's being asked here. You may also need to have your suppliers do this. So if you process certain types of data and your suppliers also process that type of data, you are likely to need to have them assess as well. Last thing I'll mention, because there's a pretty almost periodic table looking diagram at the bottom right, CMMC is going to leverage a weighted scoring system. It hasn't been publicly published yet, but what this is showing is that some controls will matter more than others. And so you get a score based on the weight of that control. And the ones that are red will be the most important. So eventually when that's released, you'll want to understand that as well, so you can focus on the places where you're losing the most points or getting the most points.
Okay. So one thing I want to question a little bit here. So it says, if you have a supply chain, have them do a basic self-assessment. Do I need to get all of my suppliers to do this?
Great question. So in a sense, you're playing the same role as the original buyer, where you need to understand what data is that supplier processing CUI on your behalf.
Okay.
So essentially, you're applying it based on the same rules that it got applied to you.
Got it.
Am I making sense?
Yeah. So I know in ISO, you maintain some kind of approved vendor list or something like that. So it sounds like you'd have to have some sort of classification of vendors that are, and manage that list of approved vendors based on their CMMC level.
Yes, and you may want to think about tiering that, where you have some vendors may handle very sensitive data for you, and you may want to prioritize or ensure that you know what their CMMC level is, whereas some vendors may, very low probability that they'll ever even know what CUI is, yeah. Right? In that case, you would not need to apply it at the same level. You might just say, have them self-assess at level 1 or something like that.
Okay. And then this is a question, I know it relates to CalcuQuote just as a software company, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that are on the call as well that have IT systems and things like that, just operating their own business. From that perspective, is there, in terms of where that data is hosted and things like that, because when we talk about bombs and drawings and things like that, they're not faxing it over to you. They're not, mailing it over to you in the post. It's email and it's data sharing folders and things like that. Is there a difference from your perspective of having the servers and everything in your own factory versus in the cloud? And what do you see from a security perspective more broadly related to that?
It's a great question. While I'd say 10 years ago, we saw many companies very hesitant to go to the cloud, gradually that's almost shifted full to where it's actually easier to answer many of these questions in a cloud environment than it is in a on-premise environment, because keep in mind, there's a physical protection area, and in that control area, it's going to require redundant power, redundant network, flood control, temperature control, all these different kinds of things that many companies that are smaller just don't have, and they may not even know if their co-location has it, et cetera. Whereas the major cloud providers have to do this as a sort of baseline to provide service to anyone. So there are, of course, areas where that it's not as clear cut as that, right? It's not all win. There is some risk in moving to the cloud because your data is in a different place. What we see is people are accepting that risk versus the other risk.
Okay. And then just want to catch up on a couple of questions that have come in as well. So the first question that we've got here is, it's a question around why not do the higher level, right? So if you're at level 3, what would be the delta to get to level 5? Is it really that much harder, or should I just always go to level 5 because it's negligibly harder?
Right, and I think my perspective is it is significantly more costly to go to level 4 or 5 than level 3. It also requires more proactive ongoing work. So if your firm, for example, doesn't have a security response team, it will be difficult to get to level 5. If you don't have a way to respond to threats that are new or to get threat information from like the broader industry, you may have trouble to getting to level 4 and 5. So it really depends on your organization. But if you have a robust security team, including a security operations center that's watching your networks, including a variety of essentially teams under a chief security officer, it may be totally realistic to get to level 5, in which case, I would be the first to say it's better to be level 5 than level 3. But for most organizations we've seen, it's actually cost prohibitive to get to level 3. Okay. Which is tipping my hand on what the next question is going to answer. The next question is going to be also.
Right. So here, just for the audience sake, because Matt just saw the question, it says, so most of the people on the call are probably already compliant with NIST 800-171. The increment at level 3 is 20 new practices and processes. Is that correct? And talk a little bit more about that.
Right. So the sort of short answer is yes, that's correct. The long answer is, have most of the folks that believe they're compliant with 171 at level 171 R2 been audited for those practices? Like, do they know they stand up, or are they self-assessing, right? Because there are likely to be differences.
Which is probably why the DoD started this. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I have nothing to add to that. That's
okay.
But so even level 3, I would just say for many organizations is a significant lift.
Okay.
So in terms of how you prepare for CMMC, obviously it depends on where you stand, what your existing teams look like, et cetera. Should we hire a consultant? Maybe. It depends. It depends on what your goals are, how fast you want to go, how much you trust the consultant, what their experience is, et cetera. Consultants can certainly advance the understanding of the standard and help you in a lot of ways. In practical reality, a lot of times the work behind these standards is work that your organization is going to have to do. So for instance, we help a lot of companies do things like this, roughly, not exactly CMMC yet, but it turns out that it always takes so much more time for them to do the things like implement antivirus across all of their endpoints, or do a user audit. Those things take a long time compared to the amount of time a consultant takes to say, you need to have antivirus on every endpoint. You need to do user audit, right? The consultant can then review the evidence and tell you if you're doing it correctly. They can advise, but typically the consultants don't have that sort of administrator access to your IT systems to be able to do a complete preparation. And so there are trade-offs to going sort of a pure consulting route, and it's also expensive. Okay. So we built securityprogram.io to be able to bring the processes that the consultant is likely to bring to you and make it accessible for someone in your organization. So if you're an IT leader or a project manager or anyone at an organization that needs to do a security program, the idea is that you can leverage securityprogram.io to identify your tasks, policies, training, et cetera, to be able to meet your obligations.
And full disclosure to the people on the webinar today, securityprogram.io is something that CalcuQuote uses to manage its own security programs. So there's a reason we brought Matt here. Partly it's because we use their software and it works for us.
Thanks. Yeah, and I didn't want to be the one to say it.
All right.
So just to kind of give you an idea, I thought this is really more for to understand how CMMC relates to NIST CSF and NIST 853 or 800-171 from the perspective of somebody who's building a tool to try to support it. So we already have, as of today, NIST aligned policies. So we have policies you can use that are aligned to NIST CSF, NIST 853, and NIST 800-171. We have training baked into the platform. We have the ability to complete tasks and attach evidence to those tasks. So when you complete a user audit, you can attach, let's say, a screenshot of what you did when you did the user audit, and the task organization to help you make sure you remember to do the monthly user audit. That's already all in the platform. The changes, the deltas that are required are handling CUI. So we need more specific training around CUI, especially marking and destroying CUI. We need the CMMC controls to get mapped specifically, so that right now we have all these tasks and we need to make sure that when you do the tasks, it reflects in a maturity dashboard for CMMC. We want to be able to produce that self-attestation report so that when you report to DoD, you have like a going in, you don't have to go calculate your score. It's already baked into your dashboard based on the work you've done building the program. And then we want to be able to export a system security plan so that you don't have to go write the 300-page template, FedRAMP template at least.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the delta there.
Cool. Okay.
So kind of recapping CMMC, we believe it applies to sort of any contractor serving the DoD. You have to essentially implement security across your organization at a level that protects CUI. What we recommend is that you start now, essentially. Start to think about a plan, start to have the conversation with your executive management, and maybe start at level 1 I know some people in the chat are suggesting, or the questions are suggesting they're already at level 3, and that's great, but a lot of people probably aren't. And so a good first step would be start to assess against level 1, do the tasks related to level 1, and then when you finish those, do level 2. And then when you finish those, do level 3, and just work on progressing through the program. And my recommendation would be to do that proactively based on your organizational direction and the CUI that you handle.
One question I have, and this is, I mean, CMMC aside, is there stuff in CMMC that whether or not you're working with the DoD is stuff that you should be doing just to maintain the bare minimum amount of security that as an organization you should have in the modern world?
That is a great question. I think most of the standards that CMMC is based on, sort of the underlying NIST 171, 853, even the maturity angle of it, which is based on the CSF, I believe, those are common standards that are widely used outside of the context of the DoD supply chain and provide a standardized approach for thinking about security. And that's really the value. We tell our customers, we want to have a standards aligned set of policies and procedures so that when we talk to our customers, they know we're doing things not just the way we made up, but in a way that's industry standard. And so CMMC, I could see a case where CMMC becomes a de facto standard for maturity across supply chains in general based on a rollout here. It depends a lot on how it goes. I kind of alluded to this before. I think the costs are going to be higher than some of the architects of this program think. And because of that, I think it's going to be a burden, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But absolutely think there's a potential this becomes sort of the de facto standard across industry, not just defense.
Okay, cool. Any closing thoughts?
I just appreciate the time. It's fun to get to talk about this and spread the word about CMMC.
Good. And we do have some questions that we can go through here as well from the audience. One thing I want to touch on before we get into the questions here is if you are interested in collaborating with your peers in the industry, in LearnCQ, we are going to be setting up a forum where you can ask questions and answer them with each other so you can collaborate a little bit, share best practices as you're going through this security journey. So feel free to use that. If you're a CalcuQuote customer, you probably already know what I'm talking about, but you'll also be getting some communications about how to access that information. So stay tuned for that. With that, let's go through questions here. So we have a question here that says under ITAR, there's not any kind of rules that say that you can lose control of that information when you go further up the supply chain. And so the question seems to be, why would it be okay for an EMS company to be at level 3 and then somebody further up the supply chain being self-attested or something like that? Is that how that could work, or can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think the best way to think about what I was trying to say there is the idea of tiers. So you might have, and I'm trying to think of a real example, but that's not too real so as to be disclosing information.
Okay.
Suppose you have 20 vendors and 3 of them are cloud vendors where you're putting data that is part of a model for your product. Mm-hmm. Those are clearly as sensitive as anything you have and should be assessed at the same level that you're being assessed at. Out of those 20, 6 might be companies that you use to do interviewing or finance or things that don't disclose CUI in any way. The finance, I guess, arguably could disclose
the cost.
So yeah, I'm trying to be careful, but like maybe you're recruiting a new developer or a new engineer or a new receptionist, right? That may not be something that needs to be, they may not need to meet level 3, even though they're in your supply chain technically, right? We use a broad interpretation of supply chain. It could be essentially anyone you're doing business with and sharing data with.
Got it. So like a good example would be if, well, like my accounting software, if it's just keeping my balance sheet or something, that's not CUI, but if it's got a bill of material or something like that in it, then it is.
Right. Okay. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience here? Okay. Well, we'll stick around for another few seconds here, but just to recap, thank you all for joining. We had a pretty good turnout here today, which is really nice. If you have any further questions afterwards, you've got our contact info, so these emails here. We'll be monitoring that over the next few days as well pretty closely to make sure that you get your questions answered. So feel free to reach out. Stay tuned. We'll be announcing our next webinar here shortly, so you'll get that as well. And hope you join us next time. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.